Hi guys, so in this video, we're going to be going over how to program plyometrics. So first, we're going to go over what they are and the value they have. Then we're going to go over force velocity profiling, and then how to program plyometrics based off of your sport and your strengths and deficiencies, and then putting it all together to fit it into a program. So first, let's start off by talking about the value of plyometrics and what they are. So plyometrics are explosive and ballistic movements where the stretch reflex is utilized. And these are going to be very important to increasing overall explosiveness, overall peak power output, and then the elasticity of the muscle tendon complex and the fascia. So when they're used properly in training, they can improve your output and your athleticism amongst yourself as an athlete and different athletes. So going over the stretch reflex, I call this the rubber band reflex. So what that is explained. It's going to start off with rapidly eccentrically loading. So a rapid eccentric loading phase. Then it's going to be rapidly terminated by an explosive isometric contraction, or the amortization phase, which is the switch from eccentric to concentric. And it's going to finish off with a myotatic stretch reflex and concentric contraction to produce ballistic explosive action. So think here, have a band here, it's a muscle tendon. Rapid eccentric loading is lengthening to create pull. And then at some point, it's going to stop and it's going to terminate the pull and release the shoot. So eccentric amortization shoot the other way. So simply put, as mentioned, comparable to pulling in a slingshot or rubber band. Pull fast, release powerfully based off of the speed of the pull and the strength of the isometric contraction. So when talking about plyometrics, this is how I think of them. The faster the movement, the more tendon contribution to the jump. The more rotation and direction in a movement, the more fascia biased the plyometric is, because there's going to be a lot of dissipation and transference across the body. And then the slower the movement, the more muscle biased that plyometric is going to be. All in all, though, plyometrics, no matter what kind they are keying to developing explosiveness and power output. So now talking about the types of plyometrics. First, I see plyometrics on a continuum of either slow to fast or extensive to intensive. Now, all plyometrics, whether they're slow, fast, extensive, or intensive, can be varied by being either static, so where you just hold a position and jump without a counter movement. They can be rhythmic, they can have a counter movement, and they can also be shock, so rebounding in nature. So looking at continuum one, I see it based off of load and speed. So continuum one is going to be from loaded onto unloaded onto assisted. Now with loaded, we're biasing force producing capabilities and muscular contribution because they're slower in nature and you have to overcome more gravity. You have to push against more load. And you also have unloaded after that. So we get from the continuum of loaded, resisted, slower, and stronger to unloaded in the middle. Unloaded is going to have a balance of strength and speed, and it's going to be dependent on relative strength. So if you're a lot stronger, this unloaded jump might feel a lot lighter for you, and it can be a lot faster. And if you're weaker and you can't control your body as much, then it might be a little slower for you, but it's going to have a really good blend of power. And then you go from unloaded or loaded to unloaded to assisted. And now assisted on this side of the continuum, we bias those velocity and speed capabilities, and you more tendinous contribution because they're faster in nature. And then continuum two, we have extensive to intensive to shock and rebounding, which is also intensive, but just building off of it. Now, extensive is going to be that plyometric base of rhythm, coordination, and tissue hypertrophy. So extensive is more submaximal. Then intensive in the middle, we start getting more max effort and high output. So we're thinking something like a max effort vertical jump, just max effort jumping. And then you have the shock rebounding towards the end of the continuum. And this is using impact to increase the tendon contribution, to work lower limb stiffness, force dissipation, and the usage of elastic energy. So think of like a depth jump, think of a bound, a power skip, and things like that. Now, there can be overlap between these two continuums. So I can do an unloaded jump with intensive means. I can do an unloaded vertical jump with extensive means, doing, rhythmic and getting a lot of reps. I could do an unloaded jump with shock rebounding. So taking the same example of vertical output, I can do a depth jump. Same thing with assisted. I can do assisted pogos to be extensive. I can do assisted intensive max effort jumps. And I could do assisted drop jumps, but there really wouldn't be a need to do those. Now, the continuums just help me to organize plyometrics into families based off of what I need to use. So now let's get into the force velocity curve. What do you need to improve your max power output? I like to categorize jumpers by two different categories. One is fast and reactive jumpers, and the other is slow and forceful jumpers. So with fast and reactive jumpers, we're looking at athletes with a high RSI, high concentric impulse at 100 meters per second, and they're very reactive and rhythmic in nature. So think of like a high jumper, think of like a basketball athlete. These people are usually single leg jumpers, they're usually longer limbed, and they have high relative strength. So if you look at the force velocity curve, they thrive when we get closer to this velocity area here. This is where they thrive at. This is what they're really good at. This is what they don't have as much of. So if we're trying to increase max power output, we got to make sure that we tap into some of this here to improve this force velocity curve, improve the power output. That doesn't mean that we got to go away from speed and strengthen over speed, but we just need to also make sure that we're tapping into this. Then with our slow forceful jumpers, those are athletes with low RSI, higher peak power, and they're less elastic, so they're more muscular usually. So they're really good here and not as good here with a lot of velocity. This is usually double leg jumpers, shorter limbed athletes, athletes with high absolute strength. So when looking at this and looking at the force velocity curve, we got to ask ourselves, what is your sport task? If you're a high jumper, you need to live in this speed, strength, speed, and overspeed part of the force velocity curve, because that's where your event is. That's what you're training for. So most of your work needs to be here because this is what you're really good at. But in order to increase your peak power output, you have to make sure that you're occasionally tapping into here, because this is what you need. This is what you need to bridge the gap and increase power output. So we need to make sure we tap into here. If you're a offensive lineman, you're going to thrive here. So if you, in order to increase your vertical jump, you're going to have to do more work here, but you have to make sure you're consistently tapping into what you're good at, because it's what your sport relies on. So again, and then also, what do you need to improve more at said task? So if I'm doing a vertical jump and I'm really good, I'm really forceful, I'm going to need to get more velocity-based training means to improve my power output, to increase my vertical jump. And then also tying into that is what you need to improve your power output. That's kind of the same thing as last question. So tests that I use to find out where an athlete is in the force velocity curve. I use the relative strength index, so the RSI test. I use a rebound test, which is pretty much very similar to an RSI test. I use strength standard, so how strong are you relative to your body weight? I also like to use a static versus counter movement versus hurdle hop test. So I compare a static vertical jump versus a counter movement vertical jump and a hurdle hop vertical jump. And I see the differences of the three. And then from there, I can say, okay, this athlete needs to work on this more to increase the power output. And then I also look at concentric impulse at 100 meters per second to see how fast an athlete can produce a concentric impulse in a short amount of time. This is going to tell me how much you rely on those speed means or those strength means. If it's a higher number, you're going to have better speed scores. And if it's a lower number, you're going to have better strength scores. And then the eye test. So if I look at a lineman, I can just say, okay, this lineman, if he needs to increase his vertical output, is going to need more speed stuff to bridge the gap. If I'm looking at a high jumper, it's pretty easy. He's going to need more strength work to bridge the gap. So an example profiling, I'm going to give you examples of two athletes and what I would look at. We have athlete A. He's 6 foot, 220, linebacker in season, very strong, moderate RSI, and moderate concentric impulse at 100 meters per second. So if he's in season, we have to continue to increase peak power and RFD with the use of loaded and static jumps, especially considering they're in season and a lot of the work that they're doing is high velocity cutting and jumping and sprinting. But while we have to focus on loaded and static jumps, we can also tap into higher velocity means occasionally. That just can't be the bulk of our work. And then after the season, we can lessen the jump volume from loaded and static means, which is what he's really good at. And we can work to increase what he needs to get better at with higher velocity-based training and rebounding plyometrics. What he needs more of is going to help him bridge the gap and increase his max power output the most. Then looking at athlete B, we have a 6'3", 170-pound high jumper who's in the offseason with a low strength profile, high RSI, high concentric impulse at 100 meters per second. If he's further from the season, he can increase his jump volume for more velocity-based means and rebounding because he's not getting it from practicing games. But he still really needs to train that floor of force by his power to increase his power output. Then closer to the season, we lower the volume of those more velocity-based rebounding means because he's doing a lot of jumping in his event training. And when you can increase the force by his power volume for the balancing effect and to train what they don't get from that athlete's events. Now, when we're looking at force velocity profiling, it never means to go away from a certain kind of plyometrics. It never means, oh, this athlete's really strong, he doesn't need any loaded jumps. No, you always need to tap into what your athlete's really good at, especially if your athlete needs it for a sport, but you just need to continuously tap into other things to bridge the gap as well. It's never a matter of how much, or it's a matter of how much you need to bridge the gap to perform higher, and never just canceling something out because I'm really good at it and I don't need it. With that in mind, we want to train what we're not good at to increase that, but we don't want to focus solely on that and make an elastic jumper a forceful one or vice versa. That elastic jumper needs to tap into those force bias means to bridge the gap, but he doesn't need to become a forceful jumper. Same thing with the single leg jumper. We want to train bilateral jumping to increase maximal power output levels, but we don't want to make a single leg jumper like LeBron James into a bilateral jumper like Shaquille O'Neal. It just doesn't make sense, and it's going to do more damage than good. So now let's talk programming plyometrics and how to progress them. So first, consider these things. We talked about it earlier. What sport do you play? What kind of jumper do you need to be to excel at your sport? Then also, where are you relative to your season? So if you're close to your season, or if you're in season, you're getting a lot of high velocity, change of direction and speed work. You don't really need that. You need more of what you don't get from your training. And then, as mentioned, what do you not get already from sport and practice? So again, if I'm already getting all this work at high velocities and a lot of vectors, most of my work in the weight room, when it's controlled, it's probably going to be higher loaded, less impact, sagittal dominant jumps. So this is how I program plyometrics. One, I use them as primers before the lift or before a sprinting session. Two, I use them in contrast pat pairings to utilize the heavy to light feeling and maximize the power output that we get. And then three, I may use it as the main work or speed work just to train plyometrics for a plyometric or dynamic effort day. Then how I progress plyometrics. So if I'm looking at a beginner, I progress it very linearly. I begin with eccentric or isometric loading. So we're talking snap downs, drops, things like that. Then we build a base with rhythm and extensive jumps. So I might do repeated jumps, extensive hops, things like that. Then as I go, I'll start to add more intensity with some more max effort jumps. And then from there, I'll add load to improve force foundation. From there, the more advanced the athlete becomes, I begin to add velocity. So velocity is going to be added after we can handle load. I'll add vectors. And then lastly, I'll add impact and rebounding because that's going to be probably the toughest thing for athletes to handle. So some examples of programming. If I use a plyometric as primers, they're used before the session to prime the central nervous system to move fast. This is personally, I feel like these are best used when the goal is to either lift weight faster with submaximal loads or before speed sessions because it's very velocity based. Now, if I'm going to use it as contrast or post-activation potentiation pairings, I'm going to use this inside of a weight room lift, and I'm going to utilize the force production priming of these heavy lifts to move heavier loads faster with more power. Now, this is best used when the goal is to jump higher and ballistically move faster. So these are more a force-biased way of using plyometrics in the weight room. Now, when I'm looking at weight room plyometrics, I usually use 1 to 4 sets of 1 to 5 reps of each plyometric, whether it be upper or lower body. I usually do 1 to 4 plyometric a session if I'm using plyos in the session to increase power output. If I'm doing speed plyometrics, I'll do about 1 to 4 sets of 1 to 5 reps or 10 to 20 yards to prime with, again, 1 to 4 plyometrics in that session to build on lower limb stiffness, rhythm, and output. You really don't want to do a lot of reps of plyometrics if you're going for output, unless you're working extensively. Now, in a training session, I'll always go from extensive to intensive in that session to ramp up. So I might go from pogos to skips to bounds to max effort sprinting. If I want to add variability, I do this by building on vectors and direction of jumps. Now, an easy way to get variability in your training with plyometrics is 1, use interset variability. So this is easy way to do it. Just change the angulation of your body, of your feet, of the displacement of the counter movement, or anything else on a rep to rep basis. So I might do a max effort vertical jump in a workout and have 5 reps of it per set, have 3 sets of 5. My first rep of max effort vertical jump, I might do a normal max effort vertical jump with my body being normal. Then I might purposely point my toes inward and do it from there. Then I might purposely point my toes outward and do it from there. Then I might purposely bend my body a little bit and jump from there. So if I want to get variability, I'll just change up the way I'm doing my reps because I want to add that variability and have myself produce a lot of power from different positions. That's pretty much the basis of what sport is, of what sport happens in sport. The other way I do it is by microdosing. So when I'm using it with a pairing, I say I have squat for 5 sets. I may use that superset of after squats, my jumps. The first 2 sets, I might do max effort vertical jumps to very sagittal dominant to get output. But for the last 3 sets, I may do a rotational box jump or a lateral box jump just to get some variability in the training session. So I'm basically microdosing different plyometrics to get that variability in there. So in summary, and you can find a lot of plyometrics in the exercise library. I think we have somewhere close to like between lower and upper body and speed plyometrics. I think we have over like 150. You can find them all in the exercise library. But in summary, plyometrics are used to develop explosiveness, athleticism, and overall peak power. You have to consider the sport played and the needs of the athlete to excel at your sport. You also have to consider the force velocity profile and what the athlete's really good at and what the athlete needs more of to increase power output. And then you have to consider the time of year relative to the season and the stresses already placed on the athlete through the sport and practice and things like that. Now, you can use plyometrics as primers pre-workout. You can use it in contrast pat pairing intra-workout. And then you can use it as main work as the main bowl of work for the entire speed and power training session. Now you progress plyometrics over time from eccentric tolerance, so absorption, how much you can handle eccentrically, to extensive work, building rhythm and coordination, to intensive, adding speed, adding effort, adding displacement, to then adding load, so you go slower but increase your force output, to adding velocity, moving faster, and then from there, impact, more speed, variability, things like that. You need to train all kinds of plyometrics, no matter what, whether you're force velocity or force dominant athlete or velocity dominant athlete. You need to train all of them, but you need to bias what you do most based off of 1, what you need to excel at your sport, 2, what will contribute the most to increasing your power, and then 3, based off of where you are relative to your season. If you use everything we've talked about, it'll probably help you to understand how to program plyometrics for yourself, what to do to best increase your power output, and how to make you a more explosive athlete on the field. So I hope this helped you guys. If you have any questions, leave them in the Discord chat or on this video because you have access to it. And I'll tap in with you on the next one.